Well, if we should discuss the sort of growing discussion on hate speech in Sweden, I guess we would have to go back at least 10 years when there was a TV show that had a certain impact on the discussion, where female journalists read the kind of letters they were getting through different social media straight into the TV camera, and people were kind of shocked at what they had to listen to or receive. So the first wave of discussion of hate speech concerned, I would say, hatred of women in Sweden. After that, there's been a growing understanding, I think, that many of these different kinds of hate speech are connected. So you have a mixture of anti-feminist, racist, Islamophobic, and so on hate speech. And I also think that most people today are aware that these kinds of campaigns really are orchestrated from right-wing groups, extremist right-wing groups. There's also an element of Salafist hate speech directed towards other Muslims in Sweden. But since that is mostly written in Arabic, I don't think the Swedish public is that aware about that side of things. How hate speech has been confronted in Sweden. And I would say that the Swedish legislation is not that bad. It actually covers a lot of the kind of dangerous hate speech and incitement to violence that we can see in social media. So I think that the problem has been that many people feel that legislation is okay if it was really used to persecute these kind of cases. There has been a certain irritation about the police, for instance, that they have not been that willing to follow these kind of threats up that you meet in hate speech. But recently, I think we see a change now that the police is becoming more active and the courts are becoming more active in actually persecuting these kind of crimes when it actually deals with incitement to violence and threats. Of course, there is another aspect of hate speech that is more tricky to counter, and that is the one that sort of steps very lightly on the border of what is illegal and what is legal. Lots of these people from different extremist groups are very good at knowing when to stop, when to sort of formulate a threat or really give people the impression that they are hated by large groups, but stopping just on the side of the kind of threats that are possible to prosecute in a court. So I would say that parts of civil society has become much better in countering hate speech. There has been, for instance, campaigns where you can have gathered thousands actually of participants in groups on Facebook that tries to counter the worst kinds of hate speech through using very civil language, countering arguments in a very civil fashion. And that, of course, annoys the people that drives these hate groups very, very much. But you have seen thousands of people gathering in groups like this. And there's also been like a movement within the Swedish aspects of civil society we call people's movements, like unions or even churches that has gathered together and given sort of small courses for ordinary people in how to deal with hate speech in small groups. And there have also been a number of books published on this subject. I would guess that the most tricky question here is, of course, to discuss the conflict, that's a real conflict between combating hate speech and guarding freedom of speech. And this is something we shouldn't take lightly. This is extremely, extremely important. Being a member of the board of PEN International, I have looked into this for PEN, and we've also written a paper on this that, of course, sees that there are really two threats against freedom of speech that hate speech represents. On the one hand, you have, of course, the fact that hate speech is an instrument to make people silent, to quiet them, and to get them to sort of apply self-censorship on whatever they write. I would say that that is really the true goal of organized hate speech. On the other hand, and this might be harder to really sort of perceive, you have people who think that they are safeguarding democracy by tightening legislation and even wanting to have new laws written that curtail this use of hate speech. And then, of course, we are getting closer to the border of when the sort of safeguarding of hate speech against hate speech actually might infringe on freedom of speech. And this is what we really have to discuss very, very delicately. You have one threat against freedom of speech from hate speech itself. And then on the other hand, you also have a threat from the people who wants to safeguard democracy by stopping people from saying certain things. And this is a balance act. And I think we should really, really be very careful how we thread here. In Sweden, we have a certain type of legislation, a bit different from the legislation in other European countries, and that is the so-called law against incitement against hate against certain groups. That is a direct product of World War II and the realization of what the Holocaust really had been. After that, we have a law in Sweden saying that you can say almost anything, you can show disregard to people and even to groups, but you cannot incite in hatred. You cannot incite hatred against certain groups. That law is very, very strict, and I think when it is applied in courts, it's a very, very good instrument. But there has been a rising discussion in Sweden whether that law really has been applied by the police and the courts the way it should be applied. There is, of course, also the discussion about how to safeguard freedom of speech. If you can't really make your anger really clear in social media and also in traditional media against those who really wants to hurt democracy and really wants to point the finger at certain groups in society, if you try to curtail that kind of speech, of course you are infringing on the freedom of speech. So we are in a new situation here. Of course, the rise of social media was a breakthrough for democracy, that everyone can get to the mic and get their opinion heard, so to speak. But I think we have to be much, much more aware that there comes responsibility with this freedom, as with all freedoms. That doesn't mean that we should have more legislation or trying to silence people, but when you get up to the mic, you should know what you have to say, really, in a democracy.